Hello and welcome to the Unlocking Behaviour Change Podcast, the show all about psychology and changing behaviour. My name is Jamie West and I am joined by Professor Robert West. How has your week been, Robert?
Pretty good. Spending a lot of time in the gym these days on the elliptical and keeping fit.
Yeah, I use the elliptical a lot as well to keep the pressure off the knees and that kind of thing.
Yeah, which is why I do it, because I can't really, it's too painful to run at the moment. But it is interesting how I do 40 minutes at a time and I do it at 12 calories per minute, which I believe should be equivalent to running jogging, gently 6 miles an hour. I find that as I get into it, sort of like, 5 or 10 minutes in, I can get into more of a sort of Zen-like state where I'm just, really in the moment in the whole thing. And then and then there's that sort of middle period. And then towards the end, I'm sort of looking forward to the end again. But it's this interesting time perception when you're in the middle of something, a bit like a concert or something like that, and there's no beginning and there's no end. You're just there.
I have to be honest and say on the elliptical, I spend all of the time looking forward to the end of it.
It isn't the most interesting form of exercise, that's for sure.
So we're talking about decision-making in this season, and we've been looking recently at biases, and we're going to go through a few more today. We've kind of enjoyed luxuriating in the biases that we've discussed so far, but we're going to get right into it. We're going to talk about the availability heuristic. So just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we're going to get in this episode into some of the sort of Tversky and Kalman sort of classic heuristics and biases, and how heuristics then potentially lead to biases. And one of the most widely researched ones is called the availability heuristic, and it leads to a bias which is a tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily imaginable and to underestimate the likelihood of events that are not very imaginable. And the way the heuristic works is that we estimate the frequency of something and therefore the likelihood of it happening in the future based on how easily it comes to mind, how the extent to which we can imagine it happening, and or remember it having happened if it's something that's happened to us, which leads to certain kinds of events being judged as more likely than they really are, and others as being less likely. As I say, this is a widely researched phenomenon. It does exist. It is real. And it does make a difference to our decision-making, because clearly if you work on false information about the likelihood or the likelihood that particular consequence is going to happen, then you're going to make a bad decision. Actually, I mean, in our family, interestingly, we observed this where was it you or Daniel, I think, who had orbital cellulitis, and we took. I think it was you.
It was me.
Yeah, and we took you to A&E. Orbital cellulitis, by the way, is an infection of the soft tissue around the eyes, and in rare cases,
that might have been Daniel, actually.
Huh?
That might have been Daniel, because I had
it on the
cellulitis.
leg. You had it on the leg.
I had it on the leg.
Yeah, and he had it around the eye.
Not that I remember. This is just in the history books.
No. Well, it can, orbital cellulitis can have some, very nasty, rare but nasty side effects. But what was interesting was that the doctor who saw you had recently experienced someone with orbital cellulitis where it had gone really nasty. So it was very salient for them. They could easily imagine how it could turn out. And therefore, I'm not saying they made a bad decision at all in terms of treating your case very seriously, putting you on intravenous antibiotics and so on. But they took it more seriously than they would have done if they had never encountered this. They'd only read about it in textbooks. So our experience of things can, if they're very imaginable, and you've seen something with your own eyes, influence things more than if it's just a sort of abstract thing that you've heard about.
Okay, so I'm going to keep it moving. There's another bias, which is the halo effect. I think this is quite an interesting one because it's very prevalent. This is where you assume someone who is good at one thing is good at everything, or it sort of spreads out like a halo, or they've got a halo on top of them, therefore everything they do is angelic. I don't know. But this is interesting. This is an interesting one because I think about this when you see famous actors being interviewed about or asked about political issues of which they have no reason to be an expert or have any real knowledge about. And then we take their opinions very seriously. And it's not that we shouldn't necessarily, but it's interesting that we do.
Yeah, and you see this a lot, for example, in job interviews or job selection, where let's put it formally. The halo effect, and to be honest, I don't know whether it's because the derivation is because it's sort of derived from people having a halo over their heads, a saintly. I don't think it is. I think it probably is that there's a sort of aura around certain characteristics that overgeneralize to other characteristics. But formally, the halo effect is a tendency to overestimate the correlation between different traits that a person might have. So, as you say, if we think that if they're good at one thing, that they'll be good at something else as well, when there's not that much reason to believe that that would be the case. And so, as you say, you see someone who's a good actor and they act in a particular way, reading the lines of someone who's smart, and you think they're a smart person. Or they're good at some aspect of mental functioning, and you assume that they'll be good at others. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a thing called general intelligence, because there kind of is. There is a tendency for different cognitive abilities to correlate with each other, but these characteristics don't coalesce or correlate to the degree that we tend to think they do. And for anyone involved in making decisions based on characteristics of an individual, or doesn't have to be an individual, it could be some other sort of object that we are evaluating, a computer system or whatever, then we always have to be aware that we're likely to make this judgment. And being aware of it means that we can work to compensate for it. So to check our understanding, to say, I have made an assumption that the person is going to be super smart at this. Is that really right? Let me check that out.
It's easy to overgeneralize, isn't it, in all kinds of scenarios? And it makes sense. We'd think somebody's good at this one thing, then they must be good at another thing, or even a related skill you may assume that they might have when actually they may not.
Yeah. I mean, overgeneralization is we talked about this in an earlier episode, but more generally, overgeneralization when we're forming schemas, for example, is a very natural human tendency, and I guess this is a manifestation of that.
So next up, we've got temporal discounting. So this is we tend to undervalue future outcomes in favor of short-term rewards
or costs or events of one sort or another. Again, this is a very powerful, very profound and real bias that we have. And it's interesting to consider what underpins it. But essentially, as you say, you can actually quantify the extent to which a given value of outcome is discounted as a result of it being likely or judged to be happening at some point in the future. From the next second through to the next minute, through to the next 10 minutes, through to the next hour, through to the next day, week, month, year, decade, and so on. And the shape of that discounting function is often what they call hyperbolic. It's a hyperbolic curve, what that means is that the drop-off in terms of how much you value things is very rapid early on. So going from today to tomorrow is a very rapid decay. Tomorrow to the next day is a slightly less rapid, next day to the next day, and so on. And 10 years to 20 years is not much of a decay at all. So the discounting curve, as it's called, follows this sort of hyperbolic shape. And this is very useful to know about this, to account for it when we're presenting information about things, particularly when they could happen at some distant point in the future, because they will happen, and the future will become the present. And if you make a decision today, which is based on the fact that you knew it was going to happen, but you didn't care about it enough for the future, then you're going to make some pretty bad decisions quite often. Now, what for me is a very interesting question is what underpins it? Where is it coming from? And I think it's not unrelated to the bias that we talked about right at the beginning, which is the availability heuristic. And I think what often happens is that things that are presented to us in our imagination as occurring in the future are harder for us to imagine, to fully engage with in terms of, all the ways in which we represent things in our sensory apparatus and so on, and memory, harder to engage with than things that are, likely to happen straight away. So I think to some degree, this discounting curve is a failure of imagination.
We did talk about this before, and we talked about adverts that try and make us imagine the consequences of drunk driving, or the adverts that make us think of the consequences of smoking, for example, because it is quite difficult for us to imagine those until they happen. But then, it can happen even after someone may have a big health scare, like a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. That they have been brought face to face potentially with mortality. It still can be quite a challenge. That then the further they get away from that event, the less salient it can often become again.
Absolutely, and it also shows the power of our imagination and our emotional reaction to things. It's very hard to sustain a fear reaction. So you have a heart attack. Let's say you're a smoker. You have a heart attack. You go, right, that's it. I'm not going to smoke anymore. And then 6 months later, that's just a memory of a heart attack. It's not. The emotion, the fear has gone, and you gradually slip back into your old ways. This is such a absolutely common pattern. And so, as you say, when you're trying to intervene to support people and help them and encourage people to sustain behavior change following events like that, or even anticipating them, you're constantly working against this temporal discounting or this failure of the imagination issue by trying to make things real and immediate and so on. And it's always going to be a battle. It's a battle that's never won forever. You have to keep coming back to it and find new ways of bringing the imagination of the event into people's minds. I mean, you don't want to be sort of, scaring them to death and so on, literally or metaphorically. But you do want to maintain the salience, and that means keeping it imaginable. Because if something is going to happen, it really doesn't make any difference whether it's tomorrow or next year or 10 years or whatever. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen, and it's going to be pretty horrible at the time when it happens.
Well, I mean, it does make some difference if it happens tomorrow or 10 years from now. But yes, I sort of see what you mean. That you don't want that bad event to happen, so you're trying to bring it forward and up front in your imagination. Okay, so next up we have the sunk cost fallacy. I think listeners will be pretty aware of the concept of sunk costs, but just tell us a little bit about that one.
Yeah, so it's again, it's real. There's no doubt about it that it occurs, and it is important. it's the phenomenon where you go, well, I've gone this far. I know I've invested this much, or we've put this much effort in. We might as well see it through. We might as well continue. It sounds quite rational, really, when if you just think about it. You don't want to just be going around wasting effort and time that you put into things. But funnily enough, it is irrational in the sense that it really doesn't make any difference what's happened in the past in relation to how you should think about going forward. Because the only thing that really matters is what happens in the future. That's the only thing that you can change. And so you see this with wars, for example, or conflicts. You go, well, we've sacrificed so much. We can't stop now. And that seems very rational, except for the fact that either going forward, continuing with the conflict is going to confer the benefits that you hope it's going to confer, or it isn't. It really makes what's happened in the past makes absolutely no difference to what to whether that is going to happen. You have to evaluate your decisions on the basis of what's going to happen in the future as a result of your actions. And so it's like, I've at a more sort of mundane level, it's like, well, I've paid for these theatre tickets now. I don't really want to go. And, I'd much rather stay at home and there's something really good on television and so on. But, I've paid for them, so I'm going to go. And so you go and you have a less good time than you would have done if you'd stayed at home and watched television or just relaxed. And yet somehow it feels like it was the right thing to do because you haven't wasted the theatre tickets, but you have wasted the theatre tickets. I mean, it's similar. It's similar. In fact, you've worse than wasted them. Not only have you spent money on the theatre tickets, you've actually had a less good time than you would have done if you hadn't gone to the theatre. Other examples of this are things like with food that, I see this all the time, and I can feel that people might sort of rail against this, especially older people from the sort of who remember deprivations of rationing and things like that. Is that there's food on your plate, but you're no longer hungry, right? We don't have a shortage of food mostly in Western society now. I mean, that's not universally true, but it's true for a lot of us. Let's say it's true for middle class people like myself. There's food on the plate. No, you should eat up the food because, you've ordered it. It's there. You should finish your food. Well, hang on a minute. But if I don't want it, it's not, it's going to give me less pleasure than not eating it. That's the pleasure side of it. It's also going to give me calories that I've then got to get rid of. So the fact that I ordered this food and now can't eat it shouldn't, rationally anyway, at least this is what I would argue, lead me to finish the meal that I didn't want. Now, would you tell me that, I can think of many people who would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. You should finish your food.
No, I'm 100% with you on this one. I've thought this for many, many years. I think, obviously, we know where it's come from, a scarcity mindset. And also, there's other ways you can look at it as a respect for the farmers who have grown the food and all of this, etc. So I understand there may be some kind of concept around that could make you think it would be the right decision. But especially in a society where actually, people are much more overweight than they used to be, and those are causing big problems. You need to change your model across the board so that people are happier leaving food on a plate and going exactly what you're saying. Actually, no, this is better for me to not to eat up just because it's some kind of custom from 50 years ago, which was appropriate then, but is not necessarily that helpful now.
Yeah, and what should have happened is that one shouldn't have had so much food on the plate in the first place, and food waste is a very serious issue in terms.
But sometimes you don't put food on your own plate. You're at a
wasn't even your
restaurant.
choice. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And these things have sort of feedback cycles. We're sort of digressing a little bit, but let's say you're at restaurants and people keep, let's say, the restaurants give you certain portion sizes and people keep eating the portion sizes when actually they'd rather not. And I've often been at restaurants where I'm sort of 2/3 of the way through the meal and I've really had enough, but I feel, that I should eat the rest of the meal. Now, if people imagine that the customers kept leaving, a quarter of the meal or whatever, the restaurant would arguably learn that their portion sizes are too large and they would have smaller portion sizes, and then everyone would be better off. And so in this way, this sort of particular version of the sunk cost fallacy is actually sustaining a sort of feedback system which is preserving itself rather than correcting portion sizes that are too large. I mean, this is just, there's many other considerations as well in this, so one doesn't want to over-egg it. But I think it's just a little sort of prosaic example of this notion that we've gone this far, this is where we are, and therefore, we need to continue and we need to finish the job, as it were, when, very often the best thing to do is to abandon the job and do something different.
I think a lot of sunk cost comes down to it looks bad. It looks bad to other people to either, for various reasons, maybe not finish the food on your plate. You may think it's offensive to the person who's cooked you the food, right? Or if you're thinking about other examples of a sunk cost, about war, then people are coming forward and saying, well, hang on, did my spouse or son or whoever it is, my friend, did they die for nothing? And now you're letting, it looks bad. And so that kind of perpetuates the sunk cost, because in a way you can't just say, no, actually, we have to kind of not discount, but we have to acknowledge the past, but we have to not allow that to dictate going down a direction that's just going to cause more damage potentially.
Yeah, and it's important to be clear about this. If it is the case that what's happened in the past would make a difference to the outcomes that you're choosing in the future, then fine. Absolutely take those into account. So if you have invested this amount of effort, this number of lives and so on, you've sacrificed all this amount, and that sacrifice actually will make a difference to what happens in the future, then that's perfectly rational. That's perfectly fine. It's that it's the what we're talking about here is the fact that in and of itself, what's happened in the past shouldn't be dictating what you do just because you have made this sacrifice or invested this much in it. I can totally feel see how for many people it would seem like a betrayal, or it would seem sacrilegious, or in some way awful to take that step. But then what you have to think of is, well, hang on a minute. If we're making the decision, let's take these serious cases like war and conflict. If we're making a decision looking into the future, which is going to cost more lives than it would otherwise have happened, that it's actually going to make things worse in the future than it would otherwise have been for us, that can't be right, because now you're causing more suffering than you would otherwise have caused. And so always, it's a terribly important point, this in decision-making, is decision-making should always be future-focused. It should never, ever be focused on the past.
And what better way to end this episode of the podcast? Thank you very much, Robert. That was very interesting. We did get through a few more biases this time, and hopefully listeners at home or in the street or on the tube or wherever you may be will have found that helpful. And speaking of the future, we will look forward to joining you next time. And thank you for listening. You can subscribe to Robert's Substack. There's links in the description. I've been Jamie West, and we look forward to joining you next time on the Unlocking Behaviour Change podcast.